As I've stated a number of times, the first 12 chapters of the initial book in the Bible, the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis, provide really foundational knowledge that I think is critical to the faith of a modern Christian, to understand where we came from and why we're here, to understand the nature of humans and the nature of God and the cause of sin and the consequence of sin and all of these things. We need to really have a grasp of the lessons of those first 12 chapters of Genesis. And so in an effort to try to boil down and really just pinpoint chapter by chapter what God intends us to take from his inspired words here, I'm providing an overview, podcast by podcast, of the first 12 chapters. In this podcast, we're going to be looking at 4 of the main lessons from chapter 7 in Genesis. And the first lesson is simply this. If you look in Genesis chapter 7, verse 4 and in verse 10, we're told that after entering the ark and shutting the door, so now he's in with all of these animals and a small amount of family, that Noah had to wait 7 days before the flood started. And I think that's an important point. Think about that. So if you look at the timeline of Genesis, it looks like Noah probably spent 80 plus years building the ark. Massive undertaking. Probably had himself and his family, maybe a few hired laborers here and there, but massive undertaking. It appeared it took Noah, by piecing Genesis together, 80 plus years to build the ark. God was about to have Noah own the ark, we know from the next few chapters, for over 1 full year. He was going to be 80 years building the boat and over 1 full year on a boat with animals that must have been increasingly cranky and increasingly smelly. And yet God still said, go in, shut the door, and sit there and patiently wait. Now, maybe this was a test. The Bible doesn't say this. Maybe it was a test to see if Noah would bail out. On the 6th day at the 12th hour, did he just finally give up and say, I can't believe I spent 80 years of my life doing this. God didn't do what he said he was going to do, and I'm out of here. I don't know that it was a test. Again, the Bible doesn't say that, so we shouldn't speculate too much. But here's what we do know. When Noah shut that door, he probably expected and hoped that whatever was going to happen right away. Let's get this thing over and get me off this boat. And the lesson is simply this. Boy, God's timing is never our timing. And God just doesn't think. The Bible says in the New Testament, 1,000 years is like a day with God. He just doesn't process time the way we do. He doesn't live in time. We have to understand God's timing is never our timing. And we need to have patience that complements our faith. We have to understand that God's timing is always perfect. We don't understand why that's the time he chose. We don't understand. We don't even like that that's why he's choosing this particular timeline, this particular time frame. But one lesson we pull is God's timing is always perfect. It's never going to be our timing. We're never going to understand it. It's always going to require both patience and faith. A second lesson, and we see this, it helps to draw a distinction between where Christians would stand on macroevolution versus microevolution, because science has never been able to replicate any evidence of macroevolution. So that's one species turning into another. So science has played with hundreds of millions of generations of E. coli and viruses, millions of generations of fruit flies and moths. And yet they've never been able to turn bacteria into anything but bacteria, fruit flies into anything but fruit flies, or moths into anything but moths. But what we do see, of course, in nature every day, in every textbook, we see microevolution. And what we learn here actually in Genesis chapter 7 is that a pretty strong and clear conclusion that microevolution was to be expected is what was going to happen in God's creation. We see that in Genesis 7 because as we read, we understand Noah didn't take every possible, let's just pick one. Noah didn't take every possible canine onto the ark. The Bible talks about kinds. We don't know exactly what that means today. We talk about species and subspecies and so forth. But the Bible talks about kinds, and he used to take a pair of each kind of animal. So it would appear what Noah was taking were canines and felines, and then over time, through microevolutionary changes, these canine kinds, these canine types, this canine species, micro-evolves into coyotes, wolves, dogs, foxes, etc. A third lesson here has to do with the dates given, and we've talked about this in other chapters of Genesis, but the Bible is pretty clear here as we go through these first few chapters of Genesis in giving exact dates. And you see very specific dates given here in Genesis chapter 7 about Noah and about when he went in and when the flood started and how long it lasted. And those dates are simply meant to convey to us today that this was a real historical event. This happened at a specific and a definite time in the past. It was a real event. It happened to real people, and it has real lessons for us today. And so again, trying to pinpoint when did the flood happen would be virtually impossible for us today. Trying to put a date on it, trying to find Noah's Ark on a mountain of Ararat would be almost impossible for us today. But we are to look at these exact dates and names and times given and say, real people, real historical event, definitely happened at a specific point in our historical past. And the fourth and final lesson from chapter 7, I think, is where the flood waters came from. And so we always talk about it raining 40 days and 40 nights, and it most certainly did do that in the sense of water falling from the sky, water falling out of clouds, 40 days and 40 nights. But you notice in Genesis chapter 7, it tells us explicitly what the source of the flood waters were, because the great fountains of the deep burst forth. And you read earlier in Genesis about the earth being formed over the water. You read later in the New Testament about how the earth was formed over the water. And so the water for the flood came from these great fountains of the deep. And as those fountains burst forth, the water goes up, it cools, and then it falls back down as rain. But the ultimate source of the water was the great fountains of the deep. And that's important to understand, because to say, how could there have been enough water on the earth to have evaporated up and made enough rain that would have covered the earth? Whatever evaporated up and came back would be the same amount that was there to begin with. And if the original amount hadn't covered the earth, how could it cover the entire earth this way? And that would be an illogical conclusion, which the Bible wouldn't stand. So the Bible says, no, the water came from the great fountains of the deep. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail about where did the water go. I do have a podcast on that, the same channel. So if you're interested, where did the water come from for Noah's flood? Where did the water go in Noah's flood? I do have a podcast on that. And I use, of course, I'm not speculating. I'm not using scientific theories. I'm simply using Bible verses to say, this is where the Bible says the water came from. Here's the book and chapter. Here's where the Bible says the water went. Here's the book and chapter. Then, knowing what the Bible says, we compare it and say, would science say that that is a possibility? And the answer is, oh, yes, absolutely. So if you're interested in that topic in a greater detail, go look for where did the water come from and where did the water go in Noah's flood. But a definite lesson for us is, though it rained 40 days and 40 nights, the source of the water to flood the entire earth was from the great fountains of the deep. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.